What's going on, guys? I'm CFBKings, and welcome back to another episode of the CFBKings Show. Really appreciate you tuning in today, and I hope you're doing well. For the first time in about a month, we had a Saturday of college football where there wasn't really much chaos, hardly at all. Week 9 was pretty chalky, and there were a couple of almost upsets, but nothing really happened in terms of some of the top-ranked teams going down. However, there are still several major takeaways for a bunch of teams that I wanted to get into in today's episode. Not the craziest week, but one that set up some potential chaos down the road. First things first, this was the week of the almost upset. Every ranked team playing an unranked opponent won, and then in the matchups of ranked opponents, the favored ranked team won. It was basically as chalk as it gets. The week of the almost upset, just listen to some of these games. Even though every single ranked team won, there were a whole bunch of very close games. Just listen to these outcomes. Number 4 Ohio State snuck past Nebraska by 4 points. They were favored by 26. Number 5 Texas escaped number 25 Vanderbilt by 3. They were favored by 18. Number 16 Kansas State needed a late rally to beat 2-6 Kansas by 2 points. They were favored by 10. Number 22 SMU beat Duke by 1 point in overtime. SMU actually blocked what would have been a game-winning field goal for Duke to force overtime in that one. The Mustangs were favored by 11. Number 3 Penn State trailed Wisconsin at the half. They led by 1 point going into the fourth quarter, but pulled away to win it by 15. Number 18 Ole Miss won a very ugly game over Oklahoma by 12. They were favored by 20. And number 17 Boise State outlasted UNLV by 5 points in a fun one out in Las Vegas on Friday night. So in week 6, I think it was, basically every upset that was close to happening actually happened. And in week 9, it was basically the exact opposite. Every upset that was close to happening ended up going the favored team's way. Despite the chalkiness of week 9, there were still some very interesting developments that took place. Like, first off, Oregon is the clear-cut number 1 team. They absolutely dominated Illinois 38-9, and that just never felt like a game. Dylan Gabriel was sharp, 18 of 26 for 291 yards, 3 touchdowns, and just 1 interception, and they just took it to the Illini. So the Ducks now have 3 ranked wins over Ohio State, who I believe is number 4, number 15 Boise State, and then I'll get into this later, but somehow Illinois is still ranked, and they are number 24. So the Ducks have really bolstered up that resume a bit. They're still undefeated. They're tied for first in the Big Ten, and they are rightfully at AP number 1. I think they got all but one of the first place votes this week. It was almost a unanimous decision for them to be number 1, but they improved to 8-0, and now they have a road trip to Michigan next week. Number 12 Notre Dame just absolutely annihilated number 24 Navy 51-14. No respect for the troops whatsoever from the Irish, but they beat the Midshipmen by 37 points. And after that early loss to Northern Illinois that Notre Dame suffered in week 3, I want to say, the Irish have really gotten back on track. They've regained a lot of that momentum, and basically everything has gone their way since that point. In addition to Notre Dame just winning every game since that loss to NIU, their win over Texas A&M back from week 1 has developed into one of the better wins in all of college football. We'll get to them in a second, but the Aggies are up to AP number 10 and first place in the SEC right now after their win over LSU on Saturday. So Notre Dame's 10-point win over the Aggies at Kyle Field has really bolstered their resume lately, with A&M continuing to win. The thing is, though, the AP poll having the Irish all the way back up to number 8. We'll get into some AP poll stuff later on, but it seems like that loss to Northern Illinois is almost entirely forgotten, or at least forgiven, and I struggle to see how that should be the case. Among college football playoff contenders, Notre Dame has easily and by far the worst loss of any team. Since beating Notre Dame, Northern Illinois is 2-4 since that game, with losses to Buffalo, NC State, Toledo, and Ball State. Yes, they lost to Ball State last week, NIU did. And if you don't know much about Ball State, they are currently ranked 124th in the ESPN FPI, 124th of 134 teams. Ball State's defense gives up an average of 40 points per game. That's 132nd of 134 teams in the FBS. And no disrespect to that program, just stating a fact, but NIU lost to one of the worst teams in the country. And that same NIU team beat Notre Dame in South Bend. Despite the wins over Texas A&M and Louisville and Navy, that NIU loss has to matter for the Irish more so than it is right now. And I'm hoping that that's reflected in the eyes of the College Football Playoff Committee next week, because it's basically been forgotten, like I said, in the eyes of AP voters. So Don't get me wrong, I think Notre Dame has a really solid team, and that one loss shouldn't hold them down forever, but for them to be above teams like undefeated Indiana, undefeated Iowa State, they jumped Clemson, whose only loss is to Georgia instead of Northern Illinois, and now a lot of those teams don't have the resume-building wins that Notre Dame has, but they also don't have anywhere near as bad a loss, or in Indiana or Iowa State, or even Pitt's case, a loss at all. I predicted Notre Dame to make the college football playoff, and it would benefit me if that NIU loss continued to be forgotten, but like I said before, that really is the worst loss that any contender has, and I feel like it has to matter a little bit more than it seems like people are treating it right now. We'll go from Notre Dame right to Texas A&M. The number 14 Aggies pulled away from number 8 LSU to earn a 38-23 victory on Saturday night. Texas A&M, after Marcel Reed came in, kind of ran over LSU late in that game, and A&M is now the only remaining undefeated team in SEC play and the lone number 1 team in SEC standings. If you didn't watch the game, Connor Wigman got the start at quarterback for A&M, but he really had a rough night. He was just 6 of 18, which is 33%, for 64 yards and a QBR of 12.9. So then they threw in Marcel Reed, and he really sparked everything immediately in that second half. Texas A&M actually trailed by 10 in this game, 17-7 at the half. But Marcel Reed got that second half start, and he went 2 of 2 passing for 70 yards, which is pretty solid in itself, obviously 100% completion percentage on those limited attempts. But more importantly, he had 9 carries for 62 yards, averaging almost 7 yards per carry, and 3 rushing touchdowns in the second half. LSU just really didn't have an answer for it in the second half, and the Aggies ended that game on a 31-6 run. It was 17-7 LSU, 31-6 run, 38-23 final, Texas A&M. And after that week 1 loss to Notre Dame, falling out of the poll, being unranked for a couple weeks, nearly losing to Bowling Green at home. A lot of people forget about that one too. And after all of that, though, Texas A&M is now 7-1 with just one ranked team left to play. Their remaining schedule is at South Carolina, who they're shockingly just a 2.5-point favorite over, then New Mexico State, at Auburn, and number 6 Texas to cap off the regular season. And I mentioned it, I think, in the last episode, but they've gotten really every single big game at home. They got Notre Dame at home. They got Missouri at home when they were in the top 10. They got number 8 LSU at home, and then number 6 Texas at home. So we'll see where the CFP committee ranks them on Tuesday, but the Aggies are looking really strong to contend for a college football playoff spot. Number 13 Indiana defeated Washington 31-17. And despite that win and all of their others, the Hoosiers continued to be severely disrespected. Just for a second, forget that we're talking about Indiana here. Just listen to these numbers and tell me if any big-name program would be number 13 after doing this. Just forget that we're talking about Indiana entirely, and listen to what they've done this season. They have a record of 8-0. Their offense is scoring 46.5 points per game. That is number 2 in the FBS. The defense is allowing just 14.1 points per game. That's number 7 in the FBS. Those numbers mean they're averaging a 32-point win. And you could even round up and say 33. They're averaging a 47-14 win. They're undefeated in conference play in the Big Ten and tied for first in Big Ten standings with the AP number 1 team right now. In any other previous season, that sounds like I'm describing Ohio State. That sounds like I'm describing maybe last year's Michigan team, but if they scored more. And yes, the resume isn't that impressive. The strength of schedule is pretty weak. But they've done exactly what you're supposed to do to bad teams if you're a contender, if you're a good team. They're averaging a 33-point win. And they have one common opponent with Ohio State and one common opponent with Oregon. Both Indiana and Ohio State played Nebraska. Ohio State beat Nebraska at home last week by 4. Indiana beat Nebraska at home 2 weeks ago by 49. Pretty interesting discrepancy there. Both Indiana and Oregon played UCLA. Oregon beat UCLA on the road by 21. Indiana beat UCLA on the road by 29. And that's with Indiana having to go, halfway across the country, a little bit more than halfway across the country. Oregon going just down to an old Pac-12 foe at UCLA, and UCLA still performed better. So obviously the transitive property and common opponent scores isn't the best indicator of things, but it shows that they're at least on par with these teams. And in the Ohio State-Nebraska game, Indiana looked significantly better. So There was actually a funny moment that Matt Rule, in his press conference after Saturday's game, he got asked about facing Indiana and then facing Ohio State, and basically which team was better, and he just declined to answer. So it's a good coaching move just to not answer. But yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting. So you can say what you want about their schedule, which I agree is very, very bad, but they have literally performed better than Ohio State and Oregon against a couple common opponents. And Saturday against Washington, they put up 24 points offensively without their starting quarterback. Washington's defense came into Saturday allowing just 17 points per game. Indiana went over the average on the Huskies' defense by a touchdown without their starting quarterback and without one of their primary leaders. So not only are they playing well, they played well at a major disadvantage, and they're 3 spots away from even cracking the top 10 right now. And they're behind multiple teams who have losses, and granted, like Notre Dame, some of those teams have better wins and better overall resumes, but I would still tend to lean Indiana being above Notre Dame right now. But yeah, and as bad as the disrespect is toward Indiana, it's even worse against Pitt. The Pitt Panthers are 7-0 right now. They're having one of their best starts to a season over the last 30 years. On Thursday night, they beat Syracuse 41-13. And let me rephrase, they beat number 27, Syracuse, 41-13. Syracuse was second in the receiving votes section in the AP Top 25 last week, so they were technically number 27, and Pitt absolutely dominated them from start to finish. Pitt's defense picked off Kyle McCord 5 times in that game. 3 of them went for pick sixes. And in the very limited time that Pitt's offense actually got to be on the field because of how many times Syracuse would have the ball, throw a pick six, and then Syracuse offense would just have to go right back out there again, and Pitt's offense would stay on the sideline for very extended periods of time. But when they actually got the chance, Pitt quarterback Eli Holstein was 11 of 15 for 108 yards and 2 touchdowns. Extremely efficient. And similar to Indiana, Pitt has one of the best offenses in the country. They're averaging 40.9 points per game. That's number 6 in the FBS. And like with Indiana, just forget that we're talking about Pitt here. Listen to this and first tell me who it sounds like and then where they'd be ranked. 7-0 overall, undefeated in ACC play, 6th best offense in the country, 2-0 against Big 12 opponents in non-conference play, including a pretty solid win over 5-3 Cincinnati on the road. They just beat a 5-1 and basically a ranked team, number 27 Syracuse, by 28 points. That sounds like Clemson. That sounds like what Miami's done this year. And Pitt is ranked number 18 in this week's AP Top 25. We'll talk more about them in a minute when I give my thoughts on the AP poll, but Indiana and Pitt are 2 of the most disrespected teams that I've seen not only this season, but really in recent college football history. Keeping it in the ACC, number 6 Miami dominated Florida State 36-14. They avenged their blowout loss to the Seminoles from 2 years ago, and for the first time in really over a month, the Canes had a solid, convincing win. And not necessarily solid in terms of the opponent, as Florida State falls to 1-7, but just in how Miami played. This was the first time since they beat USF by 35 in September that they won a game by more than 1 possession. So they had a few close calls, but really put it all together on Saturday night against the Noles, and Miami is now 8-0 and has since moved up to AP number 5. Number 20 SMU survived a wild one against Duke, 28-27 in overtime. If you want to know how good SMU actually is right now, listen to this stat. It's not going to sound good at first, but I'll explain. The Mustangs turned the ball over 6 times against Duke. 6 times in that game, and won. And not only that, Duke didn't turn it over at all. So SMU was -6 in the turnover margin, and beat a 6-1 team on the road. It took some serious heroics for that to happen with a blocked field goal at the end of regulation, but yeah, 6 turnovers, and SMU still found a way to win on the road over a 6-1 team coming into the week. And another interesting thing about SMU is that they just completed a month-long stretch where they didn't play a single game at home. The last time they played at home was September 28th against Florida State. They won at number 22 Louisville 34-27. They went out to California and beat Stanford 40-10, and then won at Duke 28-27. So they've won 9 consecutive games on the road, which is the second longest active streak of road wins in the FBS. Number 15 Alabama just blasted Missouri 34-0, and this game was never really all that close. It was pretty much all tied from start to finish, and Missouri was playing without Brady Cook for a while, and they had a running back out as well, but there was just nothing really in this game that they could do. Alabama outgained them by 250 yards. They had 7 more first downs, and it was pretty much just tied domination from start to finish. But yeah, this kind of sets up the next segment here. But despite losing 34-0 to Alabama and 41-10 to Texas A&M, and then having a couple close calls with some subpar teams earlier in the year, Missouri is still ranked. I touched on it last week and a little earlier in the episode, but I introduced a segment last week where I gave my thoughts on the AP Top 25. I gave my opinion on teams I agreed with, teams I thought should be higher, lower, whatever, and I said in the last episode that I would do this for the CFP Top 25 when it came out on November 5th, but we're just going to keep it going now with the AP. This week is the last week of the AP Top 25 as the official ranking system, because next Tuesday is when the College Football Playoff Top 25 comes out, and then we'll get the first CFP rankings and see what the committee, who will decide the 12-team field, has in store for us. And thank the Lord, because the latest AP Top 25 is one of the worst rankings I've ever seen. Seriously, I looked through this on Sunday, and I was just completely shocked that it was a real AP Top 25. So hopefully the committee differs greatly from what the AP gave us. But yeah, this is awful. I was pretty vocal about this on Twitter and Instagram on Sunday, so if you follow those pages, you've probably seen a little bit of what I'm about to say. But I mentioned it earlier with Indiana, but somehow the undefeated Hoosiers are number 13 right now. And, I mean, they're blowing teams out. They're beating teams without their starting quarterback. They just beat Washington by 14 with their backup. They scored more points in the second half last week on Nebraska. They scored 28 with their backup quarterback in the second half. Ohio State scored 21 points on Nebraska total last week, so just an interesting comparison there. But yeah, they're number 13. I mean, yes, their strength of schedule is bad, but like I said, they are treating bad teams how a good team should. They are blowing them out. They're averaging a 33-point win. They're top 10 in both offense and defense, and them being number 13 is just ridiculous. I also mentioned this earlier, but 7-0 Pitt is 18th. 7-0 undefeated Pitt is number 18. So that's basically the AP voters just telling them that their games don't matter, I guess. They blew out Syracuse 41-13. Syracuse, like I said before, was receiving votes. So the AP voters obviously valued the Orange somewhat. They were ranked basically number 27 in the most recent poll. And Pitt beat them 41-13 on a primetime slot on ESPN on Thursday night. And Pitt moved up one spot for that. They moved from number 19 to number 18. So I don't know what the Panthers have to do in order to gain some respect. They've got SMU this week. We'll also get to them in a second. They're much lower ranked than I thought they would be, or at least a few spots. But yeah, I don't know what Pitt has to do other than beat SMU and probably beat Clemson before people start to take them seriously. But they're undefeated, and I think they should be up near the top 10 along with Indiana. 2-loss LSU with a loss to 4-4 USC and a 2-possession loss to Texas A&M. They got their SEC patch boost and stayed ranked ahead of several one-loss and unbeaten teams at number 16. And the same can be said for Ole Miss, but for both Ole Miss and LSU, it seems like there's not a whole lot there in terms of resume that's being rewarded by keeping them in the top 20, and in LSU's case, the top 16 with 2 losses. I mean, if you take a look at Ole Miss's resume, they've beaten Furman, Middle Tennessee State, Wake Forest, Georgia Southern, lost to Kentucky, beat South Carolina, lost to LSU, and beat Oklahoma. That team has 2 losses and is 1 spot behind undefeated Pitt, who just beat number 27 Syracuse 41-13. So it doesn't really add up. The only answer is conference affiliation, and I mean, outside of that, it's pretty obvious for most people how the AP works, and you just kind of get ranked higher for being a part of certain conferences. But yeah, Ole Miss has beaten Furman, Middle Tennessee, Wake, Georgia Southern, lost to Kentucky, beat South Carolina, lost to LSU, and beat Oklahoma. I mean, you put that up against what Pitt's done, and Pitt has 2 less losses. They're undefeated, and they're side by side in the AP Top 25. Makes no sense. LSU you can say the same for LSU. Their one decent win is Ole Miss, who probably shouldn't be ranked either. I mean, who have they beaten to earn that ranking? And they've lost to 4-loss Kentucky, so just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I wanted to go back up into the top 10 and talk about Notre Dame. I touched on them a little bit before, but that loss to NIU I feel like should just matter a little bit more than it is. Like I said, among contenders, they have the worst loss of any team. And they do have good wins over Texas A&M and Louisville and Navy. But, I mean, BYU is right behind them. And they're undefeated with wins over number 17 Kansas State and number 20 SMU. BYU's beaten 2 7-1 teams who are also ranked. And they blew one of them out by 29, I think, was Kansas State. But, yeah, Notre Dame, it just feels like kind of all has been forgotten with that Northern Illinois loss, and NIU just lost to one of the worst teams in the country last week. So I feel like that should matter a little bit more, and I think Notre Dame should obviously still be in contention for a playoff spot, but they should earn that with a few more wins and should kind of get back into that territory towards the end of the regular season instead of being number 8 right now. And lastly, and worst of all, Illinois and Missouri are still ranked. I touched on Missouri, but I'll give my reasoning for why this is a complete and utter joke that they are still ranked. And Illinois, I'm not as upset with. They really haven't done anything to earn the ranking, but at least their losses are semi-close to one of them, and they got blown out in the other. But yeah, we'll start with Illinois. They lost by 29 to Oregon this past week, 38-9. They lost by 14 to Penn State. That one was a little bit closer than the score would indicate. It was like a 7-point game with, I think, 2 minutes left, and Penn State scored a touchdown to pull away. So they did give the number 3 team a game. But outside of that, I mean, their best resume builder is a close loss. They escaped 1-6 Purdue by 1 point. They beat 1-6 Purdue 50-49 in overtime at home. They escaped 2-6 Kansas by 6. Their non-conference wins outside of Kansas are 1-7 FCS Eastern Illinois and 3-5 Central Michigan. They have the one win over Nebraska, but I mean, there really isn't much there for them to have earned that ranking. And like I said, their biggest resume booster is playing Penn State close and then ultimately losing by 14. So I don't really know how they're still ranked, and especially because they were 20 and then lost by 29. I mean, they were ranked 20th and then just got blown out by 30 and then only dropped 4 spots. That just seems a little bit ridiculous. And then there's Missouri. You can kind of make a case for Illinois where they played number 3 Penn State close on the road. But there is no case for Missouri to be ranked whatsoever. This past week, they lost 34-0 to Alabama. And the majority of what I saw was people saying, well, Brady Cook was out. They didn't have their starting quarterback, which is true. He didn't play for the majority of that game. But teams that deserve to be ranked can usually score a point without their starting quarterback. Indiana lost their starting quarterback. They just won a game by 14. They beat Nebraska 56-7, played half of that game without their starting quarterback. And I'm not trying to say that Washington and Nebraska are the same opponent as Alabama, but if you can't score a single point without your starting quarterback, that's probably indicative of the rest of the team, that it shouldn't be ranked. They lost by 31 to Texas A&M, 41-10. That was with Brady Cook. That was with their starting quarterback. They escaped 3-5 Auburn by 4 points. Their non-conference schedule includes 1-7 Murray State, 4-4 Buffalo, 4-4 Boston College, who they beat by 6 and trailed by 11 at one point in that game, and they beat 2-6 UMass. They have the win over Vanderbilt, who is kind of on the edge of being ranked. I think they were receiving votes too. That is the only case that you could kind of make for them to be ranked, but Vanderbilt also lost to Georgia State and nearly lost to Ball State. And like I mentioned before, Ball State is one of the worst teams in the country, and Georgia State is 2-5. So those teams also beat Vanderbilt or came close in Ball State's case. And that's about the only argument that Missouri would have any semblance of a case to be in the top 25. And after I posted some of my thoughts on Twitter and Instagram regarding some of those rankings, I received a lot of replies saying, okay, well, who else should be ranked if it's not Illinois and Missouri? Navy, for one, should probably be ranked, because if blowouts don't matter, like they clearly haven't for Missouri, who's lost by 34 and 31, why should Navy's 51-14 loss to Notre Dame mean anything? If Missouri can go on the road to Texas A&M and lose 41-10 with their starting quarterback, if you want to make the excuse that Brady Cook didn't play against Alabama, that's one thing, but they were also blown out with him starting. So why should getting blown out by Notre Dame 51-14 matter at all for Navy? If Missouri's going to drop 4 spots from 21 to 25 after losing 34-0, why does Navy have to fall out of the poll? So if there's going to be that sort of criteria set for Missouri, it should also apply to Navy. So Navy should probably be ranked ahead of both Illinois and Missouri, definitely ahead of Missouri. You could say some 3-loss teams have a better case than 2-loss Missouri. Louisville would be one of them, in my opinion. They have a 7-point loss to number 5 Miami. They have a 7-point loss to number 8 Notre Dame, and they have a 7-point loss to number 20 SMU. They've been right there in all of those games against solid competition. They haven't got blown out by any of them, and they just came up a player too short. I would say they're probably one of the top 25 teams right now with how they were able to play against teams who are in the top 25. You could also make the case for Memphis, whose only loss is on the road to Navy like a month and a half ago, and that was a 1-score game going down to the final minute until Navy had pick 6, I think, to make it a 2-possession game. But that was like a 56-44 shootout or something like that. 7-1 Memphis, much more deserving. You can make the case for 5-3 Arkansas. They have more losses, but they at least have a good win. They beat number 7 Tennessee a couple weeks back. That's by far better than anything Missouri or Illinois have. And a long shot would even be Louisiana. They're 6-1. Their only loss, I believe, is to Tulane, who is 6-2. Tulane's also there. They barely lost on the road to Kansas State, or actually that was at home to Kansas State, and they narrowly lost on the road to Oklahoma, but they at least haven't gotten murdered by any teams yet. But it's just, there's a lot of teams you could probably make the case for. UNLV's 6-2. They lost in overtime to Syracuse by 3 and to Boise State by 5. They're right there. They've blown out Fresno State. They've blown out Houston. They blew out a Power 4 team in week 1. They beat Kansas, who I think they beat Kansas by the same amount that Illinois did, which is pretty intriguing. But yeah, there's a lot of teams you can make the case for. Missouri and Illinois really, especially Missouri, really aren't the top 2 I'd pick. But yeah, at least we get the CFP Top 25 next week, the very first college football playoff rankings of the season. And in addition to the who else would you rank at 24 and 25, I also just got a lot of replies saying it's only the AP, so who cares, doesn't matter. But at least next week we get the college football playoff rankings and the rankings that will ultimately shape the 12-team CFP field. So those certainly do matter, and they carry some major implications, and it'll be fun to break those down next week. But let me know what your thoughts are on this rankings reaction segment. If you agreed, if you disagreed with anything I said, if there was a team I didn't mention that you had some thoughts on, just let me know in the comments below. All right, now it's time for Kings of the Week, a segment where I highlight some of the best performances across the country each and every week. First up, we've got Arkansas quarterback Taylon Green. He was 23 of 29 passing, which is 79.3%, for 314 yards and 5 touchdowns. That alone probably would have got him as a King of the Week, but then he also had 8 carries for 79 yards and a rushing touchdown as well. That 8 carries for 79 yards is 10 yards per carry, almost, and another touchdown. So 393 total yards, 6 total touchdowns, and a 58-25 victory over Mississippi State. Next up, we have Virginia Tech quarterback Kyron Drones. Against Georgia Tech on Saturday, he became the first Virginia Tech player since 1956 to have a passing touchdown, a rushing touchdown, and a receiving touchdown in a single game. Almost 70 years since somebody had done that for the Hokies, and he did it on Saturday in a 21-6 victory over the Yellow Jackets. Continuing the quarterback trend, we have Washington State's John Mateer, who had a phenomenal night on the road against San Diego State. He was 19 of 27 passing, which is 70.4%, for 257 yards and 2 touchdowns. Then he also had 42 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns, and then 1 reception for a 2-point conversion. That ended up being pretty significant in the game to give them a 3-point lead late. So 299 total yards, 4 total touchdowns, and then a reception for a 2-point conversion as well. And lastly, we have the entire Pitt Panthers defense for their performance on Thursday against Syracuse. They had 3 pick sixes in the first half of that game. They're the first FBS team with 3 pick sixes in a half since FIU did it in 2005. And they are the first FBS team with 5 total interceptions and 3 defensive touchdowns since SMU in 2012. Just a suffocating, stifling night from the Pitt defense, and they really have the Panthers rolling. That's going to wrap up this episode of the show. Really appreciate you making it all the way to the end. Week 9 was pretty chalky, but there were still some pretty interesting developments in it, and it set up a nice Week 10 slate for us that could have some chaos. So, make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel if you're watching on YouTube, and follow if you're listening on Spotify. And definitely make sure to go check out @CFBKings on Twitter and Instagram for all things college football. Thank you so much for watching. Have a fantastic rest of your day, and take care.